Alright, there's gotta be a quicker way to move around in this game. Biomutant, much like Shattered, which I covered a few months back, is an extremely aggressively ambitious indie game that mostly achieves what it's going for, but ultimately misses the mark slightly and clearly has a lot left unfinished. For those of you who don't know, Biomutant is a fairly large, gameplay-driven, open-world RPG with crafting, stat and ability-based character progression, side quests, and all the normal dressings you would expect from this kind of game. Normally this sort of game would be kind of boring to talk about, but Biomutant is a great example of almost cartoonish feature creep, and dissecting it to figure out what went wrong, what features are clearly unfinished, and trying to uncover the original vision of the developers is a fun thing to do if you're a weird online freak like I am. And we also get to see a bunch of little raccoon people, and I know how much the internet likes small furry men. This game has a lot of systems, and we're going to cover all of them, or at least the ones I remember. As is tradition on my channel when we look at one of these fuck-huge RPGs, let's start out in the logical place, the character creation. The first thing you're going to pick in Biomutant is a breed. At first glance, looking at all these stats over on the side, you might think that the breed you pick is very important. It isn't. The reason it isn't is because the next thing you are going to do is pick the exact details of your character's stats with this big color wheel selector, which will change the stats and the appearance of your character. What you're probably going to want to do is figure out which stats you want to base your character on and then pick a breed that looks good with those stats. I tried to be a smartass and do a strength-intelligence hybrid character by picking the theoretically intelligence-based breed, which looks like Forrest Gump's Fursona, and maxing his strength out. But in the end, this was the exact same thing as doing this with any other breed, with the added bonus of my character looking like a complete dipshit for the entire playthrough. You're going to want to avoid looking like a complete dipshit. I'll go into the details of all the stats and how they work later. For now, let's move on to the next section. The next thing you're going to do is mess around with another color wheel to determine what your base resistances are. These also aren't very important for reasons I will explain soon. Then, we can get to choosing a fur color, which is obviously only cosmetic, and finally, the last thing you choose, and the only other thing that really matters, is your class. The only thing that really defines a class is the perks that it gets, and unfortunately, you don't really know what perks your class is going to have access to other than its starting perks until later. Taking a look at some perk lists on the wiki, you'll pretty quickly notice that the overwhelming majority of perks are boring, percentage-based passive bonuses that will kind of push you in the direction of one playstyle or another. The Deadeye gets perks that push you towards ranged weapon damage, and starts with the perfect reload perk for free, which is unbelievably strong if you're going to be doing most of your damage with guns. The Psy Freak starts with an extra ability and gets a huge bonus to stamina regen, and later gets perks that push you towards a more ability-heavy caster build, and the Saboteur starts with a perk that reduces how much stamina it takes to dodge attacks, which is pretty useful all around, more so for a melee character, and gets perks later that make you a little bit more nimble in melee combat. These seem to be the three sets of perks that will have the biggest effect on gameplay, and the word big here is relative. These perks don't really make that much of a difference realistically, and the most unique perk out of all of them, Perfect Reload, is actually a general perk that any character can unlock. If I had to guess, these classes were probably originally planned to be a little more interesting or actually different from one another. So, most of the choices you make at character creation don't really matter, with the exception of your big stat wheel and which perks you take. And even then, I can see an argument for only the perks mattering realistically, depending on your own playstyle, what you personally get out of video games, and what difficulty you're playing on. Okay, you've created the perfect Raccoon Man. You have all these stats, and this complicated ability screen with all these resources, and a reputation system, multiple crafting systems, and it's an absolute mess. But it's my job as a critically acclaimed video game analyst to unfuck this tangled rat king of menus and explain how it all works and why. So let's do that real fast. Let's start with the stat block. Basically, half of these stats don't matter. You will get enough vitality and armor from base stats you get from leveling and gear, so you never need to worry about it. Agility is pointless to level over the amount that you need to use the best items in the game, which is 50, possibly 60 if there's some higher tier of item I'm not aware of. And charisma is pointless because in Biomutant, much like in real life, money is fake. This leaves us with strength, intelligence, and luck as our main stats. Strength obviously increases the amount of damage you do with melee weapons, so if you want to prioritize melee combat, this is going to be your main stat. Intelligence increases how much damage you do with the game's various abilities if you want to play what is essentially a caster build, and luck increases your critical chance, which I assume is an easy to break system. If you're using guns with a high fire rate, for example, it's easy to see how having a crit chance as low as 30% could give you insane damage output. And since guns don't scale on any other stat in the game, I can see the argument that luck is the ranged damage stat. So basically, you're going to want to decide if you want to do most of your damage with ranged weapons, melee weapons, or abilities, and then stat yourself accordingly with either luck, strength, or intelligence. In reality, you're probably going to make heavy use of ranged weapons no matter what because of how the combat system works, and because of that thing I said earlier about ranged damage not scaling off any stats, and therefore always being good. So if we're going to get really reductive here, it would probably come down to just choosing between a strength build or an intelligence build, or maybe a 50-50 split between the two. Although I can imagine that because of how spongy late game enemies are, min-maxing your preferred damage type is probably a better idea than going half and half. It is very, very likely that this stat system was heavily simplified, unfinished, and not at all what the developers were originally imagining when they set out to make a complex RPG. Agility only increasing movement speed is sort of an insane choice. Charisma basically not existing definitely was not intentional, and ranged weapons scaling off nothing, which makes them very hard to balance against other weapons and abilities, are all points that could have and should have been thought about and polished a little bit more before release. Adjacent to the stat block, we have all of these elemental resistances. Some enemies in the game seem to be using elemental attacks, but these resistances don't really seem to make much of a difference against those. What they are really for is determining how much of a pain in the ass it is to navigate the game's various hazard areas, which will count up a meter in the corner and eventually kill you if you stay in the area too long. The higher your resistance, the slower the meter goes up, and if you're at 100%, you're immune and it can take all the time you want. On paper, this is kind of a fun idea. This game is mostly about exploration anyway, so tying your resistances to the player's ability to explore the map instead of the player's ability to take less damage is a little more interesting than how resistances typically work. In an isometric ARPG like Grim Dawn or Diablo 2 or Path of Exile, these resistances are really just kind of a gear check. You're expected to carefully balance out all of your items so that all of your resistances are maxed out, and it can be kind of annoying and not really fun or rewarding just to make these numbers into bigger numbers. But in Biomutant, having higher radiation resistance means getting to more effectively explore the cool purple place, which is a direct gameplay reward for making the number bigger. The problem is, it's extremely easy and trivial to hit 100% resistance for every hazard in the game, so it doesn't take long before none of this matters. Even if you're unlucky and somehow don't get the gear to hit 100% resistance in an area, it won't take long before you start getting these hazard suit sets that give you something like 250% resistance total, meaning you only need to wear one piece of them to get 100%. So There's never going to be a time after the early game where you can't just swap a couple items in your inventory and be able to easily tackle a hazard area, which makes them several times less interesting or impactful to gameplay, which, again, I don't think was the overall intention here. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this section of the video are the various abilities and skills your character can unlock, which is where things get really off-the-wall bonkers in terms of clearly unfinished and unpolished game design. First of all, there are 3 different types of abilities you can unlock: Psi abilities, biogenetics, and Wung Fu skills. Psi abilities and biogenetics are basically this game's version of magic, and Wung Fu is going to give you your different melee and range attack combos. Each one of these different sets of abilities will cost a different kind of currency. The problem is, you will get way more of these currencies than you will come close to even remotely needing to use. For example, my current character has literally every biogenetic ability unlocked and is stuck with an unbelievable 28 bio points that are totally useless. And I'm 99% sure there are more in the game that are up for grabs. Similarly, I have every Psi ability unlocked that I can with this character, and I'm saddled with the unbearable burden of 7 points that I can't spend, with absolutely more to find. Now, with these 2 currencies in particular, I can somewhat see the argument that there is a reason they are designed this way, even though they are committing the mortal sin of giving the player a resource they can't spend. Both of these points are tied to exploration. You won't get them through leveling. Bio points are found by either opening these bio cases or by clearing out biohazard areas, which will provide you with a large quantity. This means that, theoretically, if you are an insane person and don't explore very much in a game that is primarily driven by exploration, you will find less of these points. Similarly, you get Psi points from various in-game events and altars you find, so less exploration means less points. And these are a little more rare than bio points. Given this information, even though I don't agree with the choice and I think it's bad design, I can understand why a developer might make the choice to give the players access to more of these points than they can technically use as a way to cover their bases and make sure players get enough of them to fit their personal playstyle. And as a quick footnote, bio points can also be used to increase your resistances, but like I said earlier, they're so easy to max out, you aren't going to spend very many of these points actually doing that. I didn't keep track of how many points I spent on leveling resistances, but the fact that I have almost 30 left over should give you a pretty good idea of how much of an investment was really required. Your third currency, the one you use to unlock new melee and range attacks, as well as perks, are called upgrade points. And while they don't necessarily have the same issues as the other 2 in terms of resource overflow, they do have their own problems. You unlock these points by leveling, and typically you would assume that this would mean that you need to be selective about deciding what type of ranged weapons and melee weapons you are going to build for. But, once again, you can unlock everything, or almost everything, depending on how many perks you take, and still probably have points left over fairly easily. The perks themselves are pretty boring passive bonuses most of the time, and other than a few big standouts like Perfect Reload and Sharpshooter, they aren't going to change gameplay that much. And depending on your preferred playstyle, some of them will be outright useless. The max level in this game is 50. And based on some quick math, there is no way that you can unlock all the perks and all the combos. But it would definitely be possible to unlock all of the combos for the weapons you like, and then just take the perks that offer you the largest bonuses, and still probably have a few points left over, or points that you would need to spend on less optimal choices, or unlocking combos for weapons that you don't really use. This is, of course, all annoying game design, but I can say one good thing about it, which is that since you can unlock close to everything, it's very easy to switch to different weapon types and mess around with different combos. So, I guess if you're the kind of person that gets bored easily by character builds and likes to switch things up during a playthrough, this will be great for you. But if you're a person like me that enjoys coming up with specialized builds, you're basically going to have unlocked everything you need at level 25. So this game's RPG and character build system are kind of a mess. But honestly, this isn't enough to kill a game. There are a lot of games out there that have these kinds of simplified diet RPG mechanics that end up being fine. Sometimes games want to focus on other areas instead of an extremely complex and intricate character build system, and that's fine. Not every RPG needs to have a Path of Exile skill tree. While I assume the developers of Biomutant originally intended for this to be more fleshed out, it's clear that their priorities shifted to making the game's combat and exploration more of the main attraction. Unfortunately, combat is also half-baked and unpolished. The combat definitely works, and it has its moments, but it feels very unresponsive and definitely needed significantly more playtesting and study put into it. Essentially, the goal here was to be some sort of a combination of the combat system made popular by the Arkham series and the combat system made popular by the Devil May Cry and Platinum-style action games. Doing something like this is very, very difficult, and you need expertly precise and refined control schemes on top of incredibly talented animators to make it all work and flow together in a way that is satisfying. The Biomutant team, unfortunately, either didn't have the skill or the time to get this to work well. First, there isn't any animation canceling, which is pivotal to making a system like this feel good. It's very difficult to reflexively dodge or counterattack while fighting 7 enemies at once if you're locked into your combat animations. Of course, being locked into animations isn't inherently bad. Famously, most of the From Software games will lock you into whatever animation you're currently in as a way to make your choices in the heat of combat matter as much as possible. But in a game like Biomutant, which is very fast-paced, includes large groups of enemies, and is trying to invoke that feeling of flow you get from kung fu movie fight scenes, it's wild to not make heavy use of animation cancels. There are also some conveyance problems here. Like, for example, the parry symbol you get when a character is attacking is very faint and difficult to see. Of course, you can always watch for enemy animations, but when you're fighting a large group of enemies, it can be difficult to keep track of everything at once, and a lot of this game's animations are questionable. Parry systems like the ones found in the From Software games, for example, that require the player to pay close attention to enemy animations, very rarely have sections where enemies can't be singled out, and it's almost never that you're fighting more than 3 guys at once. Stacking this awkward-feeling combat on top of strange animations, weird hitboxing, and difficult-to-predict range on some attacks, and it all adds up to a pretty unsatisfying combat experience a lot of the time. Biomutant thinks of itself as a martial arts action game. Martial arts action is about looking cool as fuck. In Biomutant, it's obvious what you need to do to look and feel cool, but the game fights you on actually doing it at every possible turn. Biogenetic and psi abilities are also very strange. Some of them, like the Mud Punch that can send your enemies into the air, has nice utility, and the Mushroom that lets you do a high jump is basically required as a mobility upgrade, but most of them just feel weird and underwhelming. It's pretty obvious that since you can only put 4 of these abilities into your quick slots, that they wanted abilities that would synergize with each other, like jump off the mushroom and do the goo slam. But they couldn't quite figure out how to get them to mesh together smoothly, or didn't have totally fleshed out ideas of what they would actually do or be for. I genuinely believe that if the development team had had more time and more resources to get playtesting feedback and really take a hammer to this, they could have figured it out. But unfortunately, they didn't. The combat is janky and unsatisfying, but generally passable and functions well enough for a video game to be a video game. But in order to get the combat system to work to the extent that it does work, you need things to hit enemies hard and other things to stop enemies from hitting you hard, and that's where we come to itemization. Biomutant does some things well, and some things not well, in terms of how all its items work, which, considering the track record so far, shouldn't be surprising. The main problem here is that Biomutant seems to want to do a hybridization of a crafting system similar to the one pipe weapons use in Fallout 4, and a rarity modifier-based loot system you'd see in something like an isometric ARPG. Like I've said almost 10,000 times on this channel by now, usually when you're trying to choose between two things, it's almost always better to pick one or the other instead of trying to combine them, but here we are. The crafting system works about how you would expect. Melee weapons have base types, which is basically the blade or the head, and then a handle type, and then an add-on. Guns work similarly, but are more complicated and have more parts. Individual items themselves have a rarity, which starts at 0 and goes up in increments of 20 until it hits 100. It might go higher than 100 in the absolute end game, but I've been playing for over 30 hours, and 100 is the highest I've seen. It's going to be very similar to several color-coded rarity systems that you're probably already familiar with. In addition to all of this, occasionally you might find certain weapon base types with modifiers that do various things. The goal here is clearly to get the player to engage in item hunt gameplay. You want weapons with parts that all have maxed rarity, then you want to upgrade them all to the max material and quality until all of your weapons and armor are perfect, or as close to perfect as you can get in one playthrough. Biomutant achieves this reasonably well, but the crafting systems seem like they are kind of an unnecessary hoop to jump through that probably could have been left out for a more standard base type system to save some development time. Something where you have the same base types that you see in your combat skills that will drop with various stat ranges and modifiers like a Diablo or a Borderlands. With a more simplified system, they might have had the time to include all the weapon base types they clearly wanted to, but couldn't, as is evident by the tribe weapons. One of the game's main plot points that doesn't matter is the existence of several tribes that are all doing that wacky thing tribes do, which is kill each other over very small ideologic differences. After choosing which tribe you want to ally with, you will be given their tribal weapon eventually, and if you defeat an enemy tribe, you can steal their tribal weapon. All of them are unique weapons with unique animations and some unique mechanics. For example, I've got this boomerang here that is uniquely the only boomerang in the game, and also this staff and the grappling hook, which we will hear more about later on. The problem with these weapons is that they can't be upgraded, so their damage and power fall off later in the game, making them useless. I find it very hard to believe that the developers spent all of this time and energy with all of these unique mechanics and animations on weapons that were only going to be useful in the early game, and also be items that you might not even get until late game, or get at all depending on certain variables. It's much more likely that all of these weapons were going to be base types at one point, and maybe if the crafting idea would have been reeled in, this would have been more feasible. But instead, the tribe weapons just come with all their combos unlocked, can't be upgraded, and feel like beta versions of themselves. The exception to all of this, though, is the claw. The claw as a utility item is pretty nice for the entire game on a melee build, because you can pull enemies to you, or use it to do sweet triple S air combos. Although, it isn't safe from the incredible jank most of the other weapons have, and it can be hard to control, judge distance, or even determine which enemy type it can pull. The itemization in the game was a little overambitious, just like the rest of the game, but it also delivers somewhat at the same time, and trying to craft optimal weapons is kind of fun. Also, if you're fans of games breaking themselves into a million pieces, you might get lucky and find an extremely overpowered base type like this gun that shoots saw blades for way too much damage and at way too fast of a fire rate. we've spent a lot of time here talking about flaws, and I definitely could spend more time talking about them if I really wanted. The game's story, for example, doesn't really matter that much, and there aren't any memorable characters or story moments. Early game pacing is a little weird, and it's possible to get high-level items that you can't use yet. None of the quests matter, and it was very obvious that the whole tribe war plot point was completely unfinished when it just kind of stopped. One important thing I almost forgot is that there is a reputation system called your aura that is either darker or lighter depending on your actions in game. It's not hard to see that the original idea here was to have a sliding spectrum of how light or dark you were and create sort of a realistic moral gray, but in reality, it ends up being a very black and white spectrum. And of course, in Star Wars fashion, all the cool magic is only for the dark side. If you want to pick up a guy and throw him around or cast a warlock lightning bolt, you'll need to be a little edgy. Basically, the takeaway from Biomutant is that it's unpolished, had very bad feature creep, to the point where I'm 7 pages into the script and haven't even mentioned the mech suit or the jet ski, and it suffers from janky animations, weird combat, and an uninteresting plot. But also, I pretty much enjoyed playing it for 32 hours, and I'm definitely going to play it some more. So the question here is why? Biomutant, despite its enormous amount of flaws, is a very relaxing and charismatic game. First of all, it's very bright and colorful, and the world is nice to move around in and explore. There are some nice weather effects, and generally the game looks great as long as it doesn't have to animate anything. A lot of the game's armor and items also look pretty good. You kind of have 3 genres of outfit to choose from. Martial arts / samurai movie, 22-year-old guy who owns a Subaru, or Fortnite cosmetic. Personally, I went with scrap metal samurai. A lot of how relaxing the game is comes from just running around and exploring the map. I ran around the map for about 20 hours before I even read the main questline, and it was a lot of fun. There are a lot of little secrets you might miss if you aren't really paying attention, and when you enter a new area, it gives you this kind of satisfying checklist of objectives and hidden items that are there. It's also probably worth noting that if you really want to vibe hard and get immersed in exploring and scavenging for items, most of the game's annoying indicators like quest markers, for example, can be turned off. For me, personally, the slot machine of seeing what item I'm going to get next out of this box and running around a pretty game world was, for some reason, fun enough for me to deal with the insane jank. Also, the fact that this game was made by an incredibly small indie team gives the game a little bit of charisma that is hard for me to ignore. I think releasing it as a full-price game was kind of a misstep. Because of this, combined with the game's very high-quality CGI promotional trailer, there was kind of the expectation of a huge AAA game. Maybe releasing it at $40 and doing a gameplay trailer would have kind of tempered people's expectations a little bit. Although I do need to give Experiment 101 massive respect for not overhyping their game like a lot of people would have. Biomutant has been in development for a long time, and Experiment 101 just kind of shut the fuck up and worked on their game, and I really like that approach. So, that's Biomutant. Is it good? That kind of depends on what you like in a game. Is it bad? Not really. The game is janky, and some of the design choices are fucking insane, but it runs well, looks pretty, and somehow manages to have 0 bugs, despite being a large open-world RPG, which are notorious for being extremely buggy on launch. I found 1 bug where this boss didn't spawn correctly, and I had to restart the game real fast to get him to spawn, and that was it. And when I say that was it, I mean that was it. I didn't see any models T-pose, I didn't see any dead bodies clip through walls, nothing like that. Biomutant might have stiff animations and an impossible to realize scope, but it seems to be a watertight game from the perspective of programming. I would advise maybe waiting for it to go on sale or something if you think it looks interesting, and go into it understanding that it was made by a small team that probably overreached and ran out of time. I would imagine that if there is ever a Biomutant 2 and the team applies all the lessons they learned making Biomutant 1, that game stands to be a real masterpiece. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. Leaving a like and a comment is also very helpful. And if you want to actually know when I upload videos, turn on notifications. Subscribing to a channel, unfortunately, isn't enough for Susan anymore, and a lot of my subscribers have no idea when I upload. In the description, you can find a link to my Discord channel and my Twitch channel, where I do Discord and Twitch things, and finally, you should follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.